Thank you, everybody that is joining us. My name is Paul Adepoju, and I'm the community manager for the International Center for Journalists Pamela Howard Forum on Global Crisis Reporting. And we are glad that you can join us. And as usual, we are always interested in knowing where you are joining us from. Please use the chat box to tell us where you are and your name and where you are joining us from today. We already have our panelists, our amazing panelists, always Canada connection, and I'm glad that they can be with us today. I would like to start with Roy. How are you doing today, Roy?
I'm doing well, thanks, Paul.
And we're also joined by Dalia. How are you doing today, Dalia?
I am doing great.
Yes, so if you don't know our panelists, I'll start with Roy. Roy is a data scientist, journalist, and media entrepreneur. She hosts the globally acclaimed Newsroom Robots podcast, which consistently charts among the top technology podcasts across 25 countries. Roy is also a generative AI specialist at the University of Toronto. Did I get Toronto correct? Yes. And I also want to introduce Dalia. Dalia is the program and research lead for AI and media integrity at PAI. If you don't know what PAI is Partnership on Artificial Intelligence. And at PAI, Dalia focuses on leading the AI and local news stream of work and supporting the ongoing AI and synthetic media program. These are two amazing persons that I just had to mention just one line in their bio so that we can get the discussion started. We are working on a very time bound, and I don't want to waste any second. So I would like to start the conversation with Roy. Roy, you have the floor, and we'll be back with Dalia, and we are going to have an amazing interactive session with the Q&A. But if you have any question, please use the Q&A option on the Zoom platform. And quick shout out to everybody that is watching this live stream on HighJNet's your Facebook page, and also within the ICFJ Pamela World Forum's YouTube, Facebook group. You can also engage with us by putting your comments in the chat box under the video you are watching right now. So without much ado, I'll give you the floor to Roy, and I'll be back to introduce Dalia. So Roy, you have the floor. I think I did that really well. 1 minute. That was spot on.
Perfect. Thanks, Paul. I'm just going to share my screen here. Can you see it? Right? Okay.
Yes, it's showing now.
Perfect. Awesome. So great to be here, everyone. I'm excited to kind of explore AI and journalism with you. As Paul was saying, I'm Nikita. I host the Newsroom Robots podcast, and that's kind of where I'm going to be talking from the experience with how AI is being used in journalism and what I've been seeing and kind of teaching journalists and how to use AI effectively and ethically in their work. So kind of when we start talking about artificial intelligence, I like to set the pace basically and do like an AI 101 because it's such a huge domain and there are multiple different things in which when we say artificial intelligence is included, it's not just generative AI or large language models. In fact, if you see right at the bottom, large language models is just like one subset of machine learning and there's just so much more. So I'm going to actually break down step by step all of these different domains of artificial intelligence and how it's actually already being used in the news industry for a really long time. So I want to start off first with the basic most common use case of artificial intelligence, which is transcribing interviews. Otter AI, it's a popular tool that converts speech to text. There's also now this feature where you can chat with your transcript. I actually have the transcript of my first episode of the podcast with Matt. Otter is a tool that I use quite often because I can go to the chat and basically ask questions, ask it to summarize all of the different points that we probably covered. And that gives me a starting point to then go on, write our show notes, write our headlines. Actually, Dalia was on the podcast as well, and she had quite well articulated like 7 different questions that we should be asking AI vendors. And I remember that podcast segment was so impactful and I wanted to reference it when I was doing a training session later on. So I just went to Otter Chat and I was like, what are all the questions Dalia mentioned? And it like listed it verbatim perfectly, all the 7 questions. And I was like, that's just effective in converting our speech to text and helping me to do the work I was doing. So that's one of the most common cases of speech to text. But we also have converting news articles to audio. There are tools like Speechify, 11 Labs. You also have OpenAI's now text-to-speech API that converts any text into a very natural sounding audio. So if you go onto like the Wall Street Journal, you can see how they are having this option for listening. And instead of reading an article, you can now listen to the article. That just helps us as a news organization be more accessible. Not everyone would probably have the ability to read an article, but they'll always have something to maybe listen to an article while they're on the go. 11 Labs is actually a company now where it would mimic an AI generated voice. You give it like a 1-minute sample of your voice and it could mimic an AI generated voice. There's a lot of ethical questions that come into that, but that's what's out there in the market and it's something that we should be aware of. The OpenAI's text-to-speech API, just to quickly mention, that's one of the most natural sounding, human sounding audio that's out there. If you want to play around with that, I've heard people say that you can really hear like all the kinds of intonations. They've heard it cough and stuff like that. So it really mimics a human experience rather than that robotic sounding voices that no longer exist as much. And then moving to image recognition to search photo archives, this is now using something called being able to understand images. That's one of the biggest powers that exists with computers in AI. And what I'm showing you here is a graphic that's showing the Associated Press's ability to search photo archives using beyond just the metadata. So if you actually see on the left side, I asked it for people cheering New York Yankees. This is the traditional search of photo archives, and it only gave me 2 results because that statement was not there in its metadata. Whereas on the other side, if you see, I get almost 2,000 results with the AP's new search image recognition, the archives search, because when I type people cheering New York Yankees, what it's basically doing is it's understanding that statement of people cheering New York Yankees, and then it goes and is able to interpret images. So this is going way beyond metadata. And just think about the number of images we'll be able to actually find that are relevant to our photo. It's 2 versus almost 2,000 results. So that just helps us with our ability to like recirculate photos and also just go beyond just traditional metadata there. And then this is a very interesting use case of computer vision, which I really enjoy to talk about. It's about creating digital archives through computer vision. The New York Times had undertaken this ambitious project to digitize their entire archive, comprising over 10 million articles back in 2021. So as you can actually see on the left side of the slide, we see this representation of how the AI is able to understand the newspaper page. It's able to recognize and differentiate various elements such as the headlines, the image, the paragraphs. And then on the right side, you can see this example of an actual digitized article. And AI has enabled the extraction of text from this like old newspaper into something in a digital space that's making it more searchable and accessible. And so one of the main things of this AI technology is really like on the impact on journalism is that it's able to preserve historical context and safeguard it. You have the New York Times that has documented history for so many years, and now you're finally able to make it digital, enabling it for all kinds of historians to analyze it, all kinds of avenues for data analysis, trends, patterns, connections. Everything can be done by converting a physical newspaper into digital. So this is one of my favorite use cases of how AI has been used in the industry so far. And then moving on to, this is auto-generating articles from data. And I have to put a big disclaimer every single time I talk about this, because this is not generative AI. And in fact, this is a completely different technology called natural language generation. The Associated Press has been doing this since about 2014, where they convert their financial report earnings into auto-generated articles from data. And what this basically is the AP uses a set of rules to write news stories about company earnings. So it works by analyzing all of the financial data like net income, earnings per share, revenue, and then they apply predefined templates to turn that data into a story. So If a company's earnings have increased over the last 3 months, the algorithm will automatically select a sentence structure that highlights a positive trend. And so basically, this algorithm is acting like a journalist who knows the kind of story to write based on the number it sees. So it follows a logical rule. If condition A is true, then like an increase in earnings happens, then you report it one way. If condition B is true, then you have to report it another way. And another important thing to note is all of those sentences, structures that have been written have actually been written by human journalists. And all that the algorithm is doing is being able to understand how should the story be written based on predefined conditions. And this happens for structured data. So it's happened, people have done this for housing, market data, sports. There was also something for COVID. People were using this for natural language generation because it had these predefined set of rules and it was based on structured data. But this is completely different from generative AI. And generative AI carries a lot more risks because it can make stuff up, whereas natural language generation, it's able to only auto-generate based on an algorithm telling it what to do. So that's a huge distinction on how AP has already been using this for earnings reports. And one of the main things is they were able to go from 300 articles to 3,700 earning reports per quarter. That just shows you how many more stories were able to be published, how many more companies were able to come, we were able to talk about. And that's one of the biggest use cases of how this was able to bring a lot more impact in the industry. This one I really like. It leverages a technique called natural language processing, where it has computers read their stories and identify whether people who are coded or attributed what race, ethnicity they are. So this is an automatic source detection developed by the American Press Institute. It's a product called Source Matters. As you can see over here, it looks at the publication's archive of articles, and then it automatically tells you how many people were based on gender and race and intersection, what the combinations look like. And so you can get this high level overview on, are you being representative of the people you're interviewing and having as sources? And again, we talk a lot about diversity, but are we actually tracking it? And this is an example of where we can actually track our diversity and make sure that we are being more inclusive in our reporting. And then finally, going to this technique of machine learning, where all we are doing is really predicting how a user responds based on their past interactions on our website. Here I'm showing you is an example of a product that was developed by the Globe and Mail, which is Canada's leading newspaper. It's called Sophie, and what they did was the Globe and Mail decided to have a dynamic paywall access to their stories. So instead of having a hard paywall on certain stories, what they would do is that they would predict which stories a user will be more likely to pay for, and then automatically put it behind a paywall. So if I'm a huge tech aficionado and I'm reading all the tech articles, it would automatically put a story of, say, OpenAI and put that behind a paywall because it knows my past reading habits. But maybe I'm not into like sports stories, and I would still have access to that, so I can get a bit more insight into their content. But then they just know which stories I would be more likely to pay for and automatically block access. I mean, at the end of the day, we are a business and we have to optimize on the conversion of subscriptions and making sure we're putting these paywall access and understanding what stories people would pay for. And so this is just an example of how we're using AI in that aspect. And this also helps with like understanding what stories should go on a homepage for particular people and based on their interest. And this is another example of how the Globe and Mail has been optimizing on their subscriptions through this product. And then finally, this is something that you very familiar with probably, because It's personalized newsletters and personalized homepage. The New York Times and the Washington Post, they've been implementing this where they use recommendation engines to curate news content again that is specific and personalized to you. The news experience has usually been this one-size-fits-all model. We went from print to digital, took a newspaper and put that online. But if you go on any other platform, you go on social media, you go on Netflix, you go on your Amazon, everything is personalized for you. They know all about your behaviors and trends. And we have the same kind of data in the news industry. And so that's kind of what the New York Times and the Washington Post are capitalizing on. They're understanding what people are more interested in reading and then showing them more stories about that. And that just helps repurposing and showing, republishing more stories and getting more stories in front of eyes that maybe it's not on the homepage, but I am a niche reader of that particular topic and I would be interested in it. So it pops up in my For You email newsletter. And so this is kind of the example of how AI has been used in the industry already, so many use cases of how it's been. But then we come into generative AI, and when we break down AI, and it's, as I said, large language models are now, again, a subset of this whole thing when we say artificial intelligence. And generative AI is basically talking about generating outputs such as text and images or any music by learning patterns from its input data. So I have a bunch of, and actually one thing before I always talk about, and anything when I talk about large language models, if you take away anything from this webinar, I hope you take away this, is that large language models are language generators and they are not knowledge generators. All that they do is predict the next word. They don't inherently produce knowledge. And that's what we are in the business of as a news industry. We're in the business of understanding and producing knowledge. And that's what large language models are enabled to do. And so I want to get into a couple of use cases for large language models specifically for journalism. One of the top use cases is generating headline suggestions and SEO metadata. So SEO, it's a tool that was developed by an RJI fellow. It's free, it's available on Slack, used in more than 300 local newsrooms. And as you can see, you can put in a story, it gives you context on SEO data, but as well as you can generate headlines that are generated and SEO descriptions that are all generated via GPT. This was actually also Hearst Newspaper's first generative AI tool that they had developed for their editors. And this remains one of the most common use cases for LLMs in the industry. Another one is turning articles into news quizzes. This was an experiment that we had done in our newsroom. I've created a Google Docs extension, and among other things that they can do, our newsroom also is able to put in an article and generate news quizzes. Just another way to make things more engaging for our audience. And this also remains another very common use case to help with research, and that is summarizing information from PDFs. This is an example on ChatGPT where you take this like 43-page document about the education, about an education report, and you can then ask it multiple questions to quickly gain insights. And this is using a ChatGPT plugin called Chat with PDFs. So you're able to summarize information and go back and forth and have conversations with it. Another example is creating charts to visualize data. We can go to Excel and create all of our charts and graphs, but this is one way in which you can just copy paste your data and automatically have ChatGPT create a visualization for you. You can embed these visualization now onto your page, and it's also a bit interactive, as you could see. So this is using a ChatGPT plugin called Diagram. This is an experiment that was done by Trusting News. It's an amazing platform that I would highly recommend you check out. It's a great resource. They help you build trust in news. And this is one example that they were doing where you helped journalists identify potentially polarizing words or phrases that might be there in their articles. So ChatGPT has been trained on all of this kind of knowledge, information. So this was an example of, you took an article about abortion and talk about how would this news story feel fair to people on different sides of the story. And it talks about what a pro-choice person would feel, what a pro-life person would feel, what possibly might be like missing out. And this is all about trying to, just as suggestions for journalists to help them with their work. It's just a way to maybe understand what might be happening or what people might be thinking about on different sides, just so that we are able to get our work understood and reach as many people as we can. And this is another example of brainstorming interview questions to help you brainstorm the right questions. I'm not sure why this is not loading, but this is another common use case, something that I use quite often as well too. This is as I'm showing you in this example, it's about trauma-informed reporting, talking about how you know all the principles of trauma-informed reporting, but especially for like journalism students, if you have to go and do an interview for the first time, ChatGPT knows all about trauma-informed reporting. And I put an example of, I'm going to be talking to somebody, a Ukrainian refugee. What example questions can I ask, and how am I going to be able to empower them through this and be a better reporter? So these are just all examples that could help you be a better reporter and journalist and give you more insights. And then this is again an example of ChatGPT helping in translating in more than 95 languages. I've been hearing a lot of newsrooms experimenting with this, experimenting with ChatGPT, using it for translation. You can also speak to it now on ChatGPT, and it understands a bunch of different languages. So this is a very common use case. And finally, creating tables from unstructured data. This is a place where you can take bunch of chunks of text, convert them into data sets, and they can all be analyzed. And this is a very common example to really help people, especially if you're into data journalism and you have to understand and create a bunch of data sets of text to be analyzed. This is one example of how ChatGPT could be helpful. And so, yeah, and this is kind of just a very brief overview of all the different use cases of large language models and really how AI has been used in the past. And with that, I'll pass it back on to you, Paul.
Thank you so much, Roy. And I'm looking forward to the interactive session, no matter how brief we can have it. And thank you so much, Dalia. Let's go straight. Are you ready?
I am. Let me just share my screen.
Yes, while that is happening, please, we still want to know where you are joining us from. Use the chat box on the Zoom platform to let us know where you are joining us from. And if you have questions, the Q&A. And if you're watching this live stream, please use the comments box under the video you are watching. I think Dalia is ready, and I will yield the floor.
Great. Thank you so much, Nikita, for a great presentation and the shout out at the beginning. I appreciate it. And I think mine dovetails very well from all of the kind of different uses of AI tools for newsrooms that you've identified. I think for me and for the work that we've been doing at Partnership on AI, so for those who aren't familiar, Partnership on AI was founded by the heads of AI research at some of the largest tech companies listed around. We have since grown to more than that number is actually outdated. We're almost, I think, at 120 partners, most of which are nonprofit organizations, academic organizations, some from industry, others from media. And the idea really is to explore the different ways in which responsible AI can be used in different circumstances or in different uses, and really create guidance for the developers, the users, the platformers of AI to be able to understand where it could be of benefit, but also what are some of the guardrails and what are some of the rules that need to be put around its use to ensure that it's not creating harmful effects in the process. And so we do so by multi-stakeholder development. So a lot of the work that you're going to see me talk about today isn't necessarily something that I just came up with on my own. It is always informed by stakeholders that we consult, whether it's from newsrooms, whether it's from journalists directly, or academics who are in the news field, or civil society organizations. all of our work tends to be collaborative in nature. The idea is to bring folks around the table and be able to talk about the various uses and impacts of AI. And so I think the crux of my presentation is going to be about how we should think about AI governance in newsrooms. So we talked about all the benefits that it could bring. We talked about, the different ways it could be used in a newsroom, whether it's in helping journalists create the stories that they want to create, or in platforming them better, or in reaching new audiences that you might not be able to reach through translation or through transforming content from audio to video, or from text to audio, so on and so forth. But the question then remains, how do you, when you're bringing some of those tools in your newsroom, ensure that they're being used responsibly, ensure that you're asking all the right questions within your newsroom to make sure that the right governance pieces are in place. And that starts with some of the principles of AI ethics in newsrooms. So that's kind of how we ground a lot of our work. It is based on these principles. First, that newsrooms need clear goals for adopting AI tools. And I can't emphasize this enough. It's not just because this tool seems interesting or seems cool or seems helpful. What is the goal of adopting this AI tool? What problem are you trying to solve? What resource constraints are you trying to get around by adopting this AI tool? Because having clear goals will allow you then to be able to define the ways in which it should or shouldn't be used in your newsroom. And then the other part is journalists already come with a set of journalistic ethics. Those journalistic ethics of accountability, transparency, truthfulness, all of those should be applied to the technology that is being adopted by newsrooms as well. And I think that puts newsrooms in a very unique position where, they already have like an ethical code. And so it's just a matter of applying those standards and values to the technology that is being employed. And that includes transparency, explainability, accountability, that should accompany the implementation of these tools. The fourth is that newsroom staff need to actively supervise AI tools. AI tools shouldn't be used without human supervision. And I know it is very easy to sometimes, trust a tool enough to say, we've done this 100 times or whatever. But the nature of AI tools is that they're ever evolving and ever developing. So the human in the loop piece of it is very important. And then more towards platforms, distribution platforms must embed journalistic values into their AI systems. And so in order for us to kind of translate that into real step-by-step guidance for newsrooms, we created the AI guide for newsrooms, which is a 10-step guide that really takes you through the entire process of AI adoption, whether you're creating the AI tool within your newsroom or whether you're procuring an AI tool. This guide really takes you through the entire process from start to finish, beginning with how do you figure out which tool works for you, referencing some of the things that Nikita had mentioned in her presentation. What questions should you ask of the developers of the tool to really interrogate it? And then once you've adopted a tool, how do you then implement it in your newsroom using responsible guidance? How do you have the right governance pieces in place for it? And then all the way at the end, ending with, when should you make the decision to retire a tool? What does that look like? What are some of the forcing functions that might get you to retire the tool? And so really taking you through the entire life cycle of it. I'll drop the link to that guide in the chat after this presentation. But I really wanted in this presentation to focus on the governance piece, as I mentioned earlier, which is sort of step 7 to like 10 of the guide, and really like zone into those and maybe have like a bit of a conversation around that. So starting off with, how do you assess and mitigate for risks when you're using an AI tool? So assessing, one of the main areas that you can assess risk of an AI tool, and a lot of these are posed as questions because it is important for us to ask those questions both within the newsroom and of the developers of a tool, and being upfront and asking those questions early on will be important to how you put together that governance and those rules and that guidance for your newsroom later on. And so we don't necessarily say, you know, this is kind of the threshold of privacy that a tool needs to pass, but we do ask you to ask those questions internally within your newsroom as you're assessing the risks of a tool. So starting with, how might this tool or product negatively impact our readers' privacy? Is there data being collected through this tool that is in addition to the data that we already collect about our audience? What is going to happen with that data? Who's storing it? All of those are questions that can lead you to a better assessment of the risk. How might this tool or product require us to acquire or retain personal information about our readers that could produce harm such as discrimination? So if you're collecting information about your readers, for example, age, gender, all of that to try and create a better profile of who they are and try to recommend better news to them, what are you doing with that data? How is that data being reused? All of those are important questions. And then how do we account for potential inaccuracies and biases produced by automated systems? Again, automated systems are a product of the data that we put into them, and that data can often be biased. So how are we monitoring for that bias within our newsrooms? What checks and balances do we have in place to say that, you know, this AI tool might be writing context that's a little bit different about people of color than it is about white people? What does that look like? And that's just an example, but bias obviously can come in many ways. It can be ageist, it could be biased against how it reports about women versus men. So all of those are things to keep in mind. And then how might this tool or product reduce audiences' autonomy in seeking information or perspectives? If we are using tools that increasingly personalize the news experience to our audiences, suggesting news articles that they might be interested in or whatnot, what is being sacrificed in the process? What news that they might have been exposed to otherwise is being replaced by news that matches their political views or matches what they care about? What does that look like? And then internal considerations that are unique to each newsroom are there implementation challenges that might be different for your newsroom that might not be, present in other newsrooms? So for example, is your team working remotely? What does that mean for using an AI tool, training and having oversight over it? Is your team really small and strapped for time and resources? How are we going to account for that when we're rolling out a new tool and ensuring that it is being used properly? All those are questions that are, for you to answer within your newsroom. What other entities does the provider contract with? What conflicts might that create? That's really important when we're thinking of AI tools, because sometimes AI tools that are used for journalism are also used for marketing, are also sometimes used for surveillance. So does that go with or against our ethics? And what does that mean for our newsroom? I think is an important question to ask. Does this tool change our relationship with our staff in ways that might negatively impact our culture, hiring, or staff relations? Again, this goes back to how you socialize the use of an AI tool. Do journalists in your newsroom feel like this tool is being used to replace them, or is it being used to augment the work that they're doing and support it and make it easier? How might this tool or product change our cost structure in ways that force us to pass costs to our readers? So if this tool is really expensive, are you then gonna pay for it by increasing subscriber costs? What does that look like? How does that impact your newsroom in general? And then I think what is probably the most important question in this list is, what is a best case and worst case scenario for using this tool? If this tool works perfectly, if we have the perfect governance for it, and it's a well-oiled machine, what does that look like? And then if this tool completely fails, right, what does that look like? And how are we creating the conditions to make sure that that worst case scenario doesn't happen? So say, for example, you're using a auto writer to write certain articles, right? Articles about, for example, sports scores. The best case scenario is that this, tool is then able to, generate content about the, high schools in your city, and is able to write about the sports scores there, in the leagues there. And it kind of is a well-oiled machine. You just have an editor that is providing oversight and checking those articles before they go out. And it saves time and effort for a lot of journalists. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is the auto writer starts, writing inflammatory commentary about the sports scores. It gets the sports scores wrong. There is no editorial oversight. It goes out to your audience. Your audience catches those mistakes. You then have to go back to your audience and let them know, that these articles were written by a bot and that there was no oversight, and that's why the mistakes happened. That's kind of the worst case scenario. Okay, now that we know that this is the worst case scenario, how do we prevent that from happening? What kind of rules do we have to put in place to ensure that that never happens within our newsroom? Okay, governance, I think, is a word that we're often afraid of, because it seems like a big thing. Like, we're establishing governance. It seems like the job of literally the government. But governance is primarily a combination of two key factors: accountability and transparency. How are we being transparent with our audience, with our newsroom members, with our journalists about how this AI tool should be used? And then accountability, as in what are the guardrails? Who is responsible for the use of this tool? If this tool makes mistakes, who do we go back to? And who is responsible in maintaining that relationship between the newsroom and the tool developers, and having that line of communication there? So governance really is just like a catch-all term for those two pieces, or to answer those questions. And let's get into it a little bit. Again, governance is going to look different from one newsroom to another, and it will look different depending on what types of tools you're using and how resource intense they are, how much data they collect, how risky it is to use them. Are they audience facing? Are they internal? How complex are they? All of that is going to kind of impact the level of detail and the level of the level of intensity at which you're going to have to answer some of these questions. But I think within a newsroom, every newsroom needs to decide the answer to some of these questions as it pertains to them. Who is primarily responsible for the tool and its use? It can't be an entire team. There needs to be a single point of contact that is responsible for the tool and its use, and is then in contact with the tool developer. It's important for those things to be established early on, so that things don't fall into the cracks. Because things fall in the cracks when things go wrong. You come back to the team and you're like, hey, who's responsible for the tool? And then the team is like, well, I thought he was, and I thought she was, and it gets very complicated very quickly. So having a very clear line of communication and accountability from the beginning is really important. Who will be able to use the tool in your newsroom? Just because the tool is available doesn't mean that everyone should have access to it. Doesn't mean that everyone should be using it in their work. An auto writer that is being exclusively employed for sports news or for housing sale costs or whatever, shouldn't be used for breaking news. So that access needs to be clearly delineated. And then the transparency piece: how will you communicate to your audience the use of this tool? And then finally, what metrics will you track to determine if this tool is actually helping your newsroom? In what ways, and this goes back to this whole idea that we talked about in the beginning, being very intentional about why you're adding an AI tool to your newsroom. Because once you have that goal or intention in place, then you can go back and establish those metrics in a way that makes sense for your newsroom. If your goal is to increase readership, well, how is that tool going to get you from point A to increased readership? What are you going to measure in that process? what happens when things go wrong? You know, again, talking about that worst case scenario, how do you create a plan for it? What is the course of correction? What's the communication plan if it needs to be communicated to your audience? The other part is, can you pilot the tool? Can you use it in a very limited use case before it's rolled out, you know, to the entire organization? And then what are the necessary changes in your newsroom to ensure the successful launch of the tool? So if this tool is being added to a specific team, does their workflow change? Do they need to be trained on the tool? How's that going to happen? Accounting for those pieces is all part of governance. And then what mechanisms will you use to collect feedback on how this tool is doing, both from the people in your newsroom who are using the tool, and if it's audience facing, from your audiences? Is there a way for them to submit complaints if there's errors in the article or in the news piece? Is there a way for them to provide feedback on the quality of the news and how it's changed since you started using this tool? And what does that look like? And then last piece before we wrap up, because I know we want to get to questions, planning for the future. Understand the life cycle of a tool. As I mentioned earlier, it's not just about getting to the point where you're using the tool in your newsroom and you're using it in a way that serves the newsroom's operations. Like any technology, an AI tool will age with time. There will be better tools that come out. There will be tools that might serve you better. So how do you ensure that you are making an intentional decision, once again, about retiring a tool and bringing in something new, or retiring a tool because it no longer serves your newsroom? And how do you make that part of the decision-making process and the accountability process that we talked about earlier? So questions that you might want to be asking is, what does continual maintenance look like? How are we going to make sure that this tool is maintained, that we're checking in on a 6-month basis, on a yearly basis, to say, hey, does this tool really still serve our goals? Or, you know, is there something better out there that we should be using? Or, you know, have our needs changed within the newsroom and we no longer need this tool? What does that look like? Who will be responsible for future and continued communication with the tool provider? How can you ensure that the tool continues to operate as intended? As I mentioned, AI tools are continually being improved upon by their developers. There's updates to the tool. There are changes that are being made. How can we ensure that that continues to serve our intentions as an organization? And then if there are any new processes that you need to bring in to account for negative impacts of the tool. So say, for example, you implemented the tool, it's working great. And then all of a sudden you start getting negative feedback from your audience about how, you know, they're seeing the news or how it's impacting the news quality. What then can you do within your newsroom to reassess and say, okay, can we regroup, see how this technology is or isn't working for us, and then implement changes as needed? And then last but not least, determining when you should no longer be using the tool. Instances in which that might happen is if there are ethical concerns, if the reason the tool is being used has changed. So for example, if you realize that like the data that's being collected about your audience is being resold by the tool developer to marketing agencies, for example, and that's something that goes against your newsroom's ethics, then maybe that's something to reconsider. Or in a different instance, if a tool that was once being used to provide you with tips on like breaking news on social media, blah, 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 is now being used by the police for the same purpose and to find, you know, or to surveil people in the population, is that something that, you know, goes against your newsroom's ethics? And if so, you have to make a conscious decision about whether or not you want to continue or discontinue using that tool. Again, a huge part of this is just highlighting the areas in which a newsroom might want to intentionally make some of those decisions, as opposed to just, you know, bringing in a tool, putting it in place and just letting it run on autopilot. I think that's like a major distinction between AI tools and other pieces of software and technology that we're used to, is that AI tools require that maintenance, require that oversight, and are not necessarily tools that we just kind of implement and let run for a lifetime. So yeah, that's it from my end. I hope this was a helpful overview. And as I mentioned earlier, I'll drop the link to the full guide in the comments, and you can kind of peruse it and read it at your own time. And feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Dalia. Thank you so much, Roy. And thank you once again for accepting our invitation. So let's start this discussion around what we are seeing as the current state of the landscape. Do you personally think the AI landscape has been stabilized such that you remember when it all started, we are seeing all different tools popping out, different people make different opinions, different organizations establishing different policies on how to do it. Regarding the different phases that we have right now, where do you think we have? Have we reached the stable phase, or we are still in the very early chaotic space that is characterized with reintroduction of new tools that could create difficulty in establishing some stability in media houses on how to engage and utilize these tools? What do you think, Roy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we are still very early on, especially in the generative AI phase. This year was all about text generation tools like ChatGPT. Next year is going to be all about multimodal AI, where you're inputting text, video, images, getting all of that back. There's a lot of development and advancements going on. One of the biggest things, a lot of issues with generative AI has still not been solved. Number one, hallucinations. There's also a lot of security concerns. There's something called prompt injection. Google that, you'll find out a whole bunch of security issues that exist with generative AI. So we are still very early on, I would say, and it's still that chaotic phase. But I would highly emphasize that this is the time to still be experimenting. Every news organization should be experimenting and putting in processes where people are familiar with this technology. I think one of the biggest differences with generative AI is that it's an accessible technology. You don't need to know how to code. You are going to be able to just go onto a tool like ChatGPT and ask questions in natural language. But just because it's able to give you an answer in natural language doesn't mean you are actually using that tool right. It still requires a process of knowing how to interact with these models, what that looks like, and that's not something that happens overnight. It's a process that you need to continuously work on. So even though all of these issues are happening with this technology, it's going to be resolved. So that's why we need to focus on experimenting right now so that we would know and have different ideas of how to use this tool. What are the safe use cases for it?
Quick follow-up, Dalia. What do you think about that before I go to a question that is specifically for you?
I mean, if we're talking about generative AI, like I fully agree with Nikita. Like I think it's still very early on in its uses. But if we're talking more like broadly about AI tools in general that are being used in newsrooms, I feel like those have been around for a little bit longer. And so those have kind of reached a little bit more of a stabilization phase, or like let's figure out how to use them in a way that serves newsrooms, and we can really like scrutinize some of the ethical questions as it comes to their use. I think Nikita was spot on her analysis of like Gen AI and what that means, and how that's still developing. I do like want to emphasize as well that adoption is going to look different for AI tools in different areas of the world. When we talk a lot about AI tools, we tend to primarily talk about like an English speaking world, because that's who the tool developers tend to be. That's kind of their main audience when they're thinking of who will be using these tools. So in that sense, yes, we might be further ahead. I would say, in other areas of the world, especially non-English, non-Latin, so like not Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, speaking languages, the tool's quality and their efficacy tends to decline quite heavily. And then when you come to Gen AI and especially language models, that's kind of where things get a lot more tricky. I have yet to find a solid language model in Arabic, for example, that is usable, that is dependable, in the same way that like they're available in English. And so I think that kind of is important to think about when we're thinking about using AI tools in non-English speaking contexts?
Yeah, thank you very much. Right. So there's a question I have that I think both of you are really, really perfect for to answer from a different perspective, which is at the bedrock of journalism is that seal that this is a trusted news. That was the process of gathering the news was trusted, and it was produced by a professional. But in your presentation, Roy, you showed how some of these top media outlets are already producing it. So looking at the landscape, okay, thank you very much. Looking at the landscape, what do you think? Do you still think that is still possible as we see more AI taking more roles? And do you think it will still be necessary? How do you think journalism can maintain that verified, trusted source that even journalists that are not tech experts can still be able to say that the process through which every machinery, every tool that did journalism to work has passed through can still be independently trusted without any unknown introduction of AI-induced bias? What do you think, Roy?
Yeah, I think, okay, if we are, again, AI, if you're talking generative AI specifically, AI has already been used in the news industry for a long time with auto-generating, and we still maintain that trust. When we're talking about generative AI, the issue then becomes about how are we implementing it within our newsrooms organization? And as I said, all about that it's doing is it's focusing on language generation and not really knowledge generation. We are in the business of knowledge generation. I see generative AI as like a second set of eyes to help you out with any task that you're doing. Maybe, for example, a lot of the tasks that I showed you, none of those that of use cases of LLMs, none of those are something that goes direct to production, and it should never go direct to production. Generative AI is still not at a stage where you can have any user interface tool as well. You always need a human in the loop for generative AI because of all of the concerns regarding hallucinations and security risks that are there. So in that regards, I actually see it in a way where if we are going to see, we're already seeing a bunch of like AI generated articles, and you go on to you have like AI avatars and AI videos, and your social media influencers are going to be AI avatars. Basically, in a world where you're going to see so much of AI, I think the value of journalism becomes super important because we will still be in the business of knowledge creation. We will be still the people. That's something that AI can't really replicate. That ability to go and talk to people, get the news, get the source. We'll be seeing a lot more of reporting, I would say, and versus writing, as that's something that AI will assist and help you out within editing, because at the end of the day, that's the role of a journalist. That's what we do, and I think that will actually build a lot of trust, because as I was showing you examples of bias, maybe like SEO headlines, SEO descriptions, it's helping you out over there as a second set of eyes.
Yeah, I really want Dalia's thoughts, but Dalia, please keep your response because Roy really needs to go. And I have this question from our audience that I want Roy to take before she takes her leave. So Jati would like to know, there are serious concerns over the quality of AI-generated news. How do you think we should address these concerns in the newsroom? How long will it take to survive this chaotic phase? Questions are both for Nikita and Dalia. So Roy will start. Dalia will also respond and had also thoughts on the previous question. Nikita, you have the floor. That's the last question.
Awesome. Yeah, so AI generated news, as I said, there's a difference again between natural language generation for AI generated news and generative AI for writing for news. Natural language generation, trust it because it has the ability. You write in an algorithm and you tell it what it should be doing. As I showed you, AP has been doing it for nearly a decade now. And it's been used across newsrooms around the world. That's reliable, and that helps us get more stories into people's hands. AI generated news using generative AI, using ChatGPT to write the news is a big no-go for me. If you are not there to edit it, make sure you're fact checking it. Maybe if you want to get a first draft and I still think that ChatGPT doesn't write good news. But maybe if you're able to fine tune a large language model that trains on all of your data, if you have the capabilities to do that, that's trained on your newsroom, and then it's able to produce news, that's okay. But still, think of it like any reporter. If you're an editor and you get a story from any reporter, like any freelance journalist, you are still going to be fact checking every single statement. You will still edit it out. You don't put a journalist article that you get straight away from the news text right into production. That's how you would have to still think about AI generated news. I don't think that's the best use case for generative AI right now. Because we're in the journalism industry, I think we automatically think about, let's use generative AI for writing, because it seems to be language. But there are so many use cases. Think about the business side, think about operations side, think about all of the back office support, think about all of the mundane tasks that you have to do in a newsroom. Writing is what we're good at. We are good as being journalists. We are good at reporting. So let's keep that human, authentic voice still out there and focus on generative AI to help out with all of the other tasks that maybe are not as high risk, especially that we'd be doing in the newsroom.
Thank you, Nikita. Dalia, over to you. Take it from there. What are your thoughts?
I agree. I think that it also will look different for different newsrooms, whether or not AI tools and those types of AI tools make sense for them. The message isn't you have to use AI tools. I think the message that Nikita and I are both trying to get across is use it in a way that serves you best, in a way that makes sense for your newsroom, in a way that where the benefits will outweigh the risks and you are aware of the risks and you're mitigating for them. So when we talk about, yes, the quality isn't there, or we're still a bit in like the chaotic phase, I think it's important to say, okay, like how can we use it in a way that serves our newsroom and what we're trying to do, and stays away from some of those more I would say risky use cases. And in the process, how do we maintain that like level of accountability and transparency that it generates that quality journalism, and upholds our journalistic values?
Nikita, last words?
Yeah, I really, as I would say, is experiment with generative AI. I think this is going to be changing the world as we know it. We are going to be living in a world that is going to be driven by AI. And as journalists, I think we owe it to be experimenting with this tool so that we are able to be authentic and know the dangers of it, talk about it with our audience. But also it's going to change the way we do work. And as I always say, use it for its language generation capabilities, and it's not a knowledge generator. That's what we are in the business of, creating knowledge.
Dalia, last words?
I would echo what Nikita said about experimenting, and I would say, pilot things, try them out on a small scale before rolling them out on a larger scale, and don't be afraid to ask questions. I think the biggest things that I talk to journalists about is, if you're procuring the use of a technology from a company, you have all the right in the world to ask all the questions that you want. No question is too dumb, and AI in of itself as a technology is a learnable technology. I think people look at AI and they think, oh my goodness, like this is such a new piece of technology. Like I'm not an engineer, I'll never understand how it works. No, you can understand how it works. It is accessible for you to understand the nitty-gritty pieces of it, even if you don't code. And I would encourage everyone to kind of look behind the veil and really, engage with that technology at a deeper level in a way that makes it less mysterious to us all. So yeah.
And on that note, I want to appreciate our panelists for being so resourceful today. And I say thank you very much. I've put a link for you to engage with us so that you can access all the tools, all the resources, and everything that we can help you with. So on this note, I want to say thank you very much, Nikita. Thank you, Dalia, for accepting our invitation, and enjoy the rest of the day. Everyone, is bye from me.